All right, everybody, welcome. It is Thursday, August 28th, 2014. Several years into Thunderdome, and Russia, the Ukraine, and guess who? Germany are in the news, and this may be a pretty significant story uh, because I want you to put it into the context of what I've been suggesting and speculating in recent news and views and several blogs, and that is that Germany is apparently playing its old diplomatic game, east and west, all right, walking that tightrope. But as I've been indicating, I suspect that Germany's economy, which is hugely export driven, and its economic ties for energy to Russia are going to push it ultimately, not necessarily in the mid to short term, but ultimately into the Eurasian camp. And there's two articles that I want to talk about today. The first appeared on Dr. Paul Craig Roberts' website. This article is by a German financial advisor who runs his own website. His name is Roman Bautzis, all right? And the second article I want to talk about is from the Eurasian Times, and we'll get to that because it's hugely significant in the context of my hypothesis that we are watching a long-term game, a long-term dance that is being orchestrated by Germany eventually to extricate itself and possibly the EU from Washington's thumb. Now, Mr. Bautzis, the first article states this, and again, he is a financial advisor writing on his own blog site in Germany, and this article appeared courtesy of Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, for whom he apparently wrote the article. The title is Political Europe Suppressed Under Washington's Thumb is Waking Up. And I'm going to read a few paragraphs. I'll link it to you. He states, first of all, this, quote, "It was not long, however, before the public mood in Europe began to turn. A pivotal factor was openly voiced by U.S. threats in a law that had been passed by both the House of Representatives and the Senate of the U.S. Congress that could eventually result in an American invasion of the Netherlands by United States Army forces." And he gives the link in Der Spiegel. When this was learned, outrage was expressed not only within the Dutch government, but among the population of the country. Can't blame them. According to the law, if it should ever happen that American citizens are brought before the International Criminal Court, that's the one at The Hague, folks, and accused, Washington would exercise the preemptive right to invade the country in order to prevent prosecution. Remember that Malaysia's government had permitted a tribunal in 2011 whose judges, in the tradition of British court proceedings, condemned both George W. Bush and Tony Blair as war criminals. And then he gives a link to Al Jazeera. Some Europeans are asking if there could be a connection between the ruling of this tribunal and the loss of the two Malaysian airliners. Now stop and think about that, folks. I can well understand the Dutch reserve, the Dutch outrage over the United States passing a law which would allow the country to invade the Netherlands if any Americans are ever charged and brought before the World Court at The Hague. But I'm also going to suggest to you that that measure is an indicator of something else. It's an indicator of how panicked the upper elite and oligarchy within the West, within the Anglo-American power structure, really are. All right. Now let me continue with Herbatz's article. He states, quote, "Germans wonder why their reunited country is still occupied by U.S. troops 69 years after the end of World War II. Well, from the American point of view, the answer is because your country is reunited. Germany reunited, as everybody knows, has always been an industrial and military powerhouse. And look at its ranking in terms of gross domestic products among the various nations of the world today. Now, he goes on to say, why isn't why is the country still occupied, and why their country has no foreign policy independent of Washington? Well, again, it's because their country is occupied. And why the German media provides no public discussion of these highly unusual characteristics of an allegedly sovereign state. Now, let me stop again. Because now what you're seeing happen, and this is kind of a prediction I made, you're seeing the discontent with Washington being coupled to American occupation, all right, and to the issue of German sovereignty. So, in other words, this is the beginning, in my opinion, of a long-term agenda that is going to be driven using American bases, using American troops in Germany as a wedge or lever to question their sovereignty and ultimately drive American bases out of Germany altogether. Now, I've also suggested something else. America will simply shift those bases eastward into Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states. So, in other words, you have to look at the base closings now going on, being undertaken by the Pentagon in Europe, and view them in this wider context of geopolitics. They're catering to public opinion, and you're going to see more and more bases shut down, and they're going to keep getting bigger and bigger. But they're simply going to move them into Eastern Europe, all right? During the last several years, the media's propagandistic character has led to massive resistance among newspaper readers, especially in Germany. You have only to take a look at the comments published on internet sites of the mainstream media in that country to see angry and disappointed readers turn away from their once favorite newspapers that are accused of actively participating in Washington's propaganda campaign. Readers see propaganda instead of investigative journalism. In place of evidence and honest reports, there are insinuations and ridiculous accusations. The German newspaper Die Welt even blamed the outbreak of the Ebola virus on Russia, and he gives a link for that. And a little later on in the article, he states this. Some of the large German newspapers destroyed what little credibility they had left when they used social media to spread their claim that the negative comments on their websites were written by people on the payroll of Vladimir Putin. One doesn't know whether to laugh or cry over this grotesque assertion. Now, stop. That may be true, but I also suggest an alternative scenario. That might be a deliberate way of creating a social structure, social engineering, and opinion in Germany that is going to help create the critical mass, the popular pressure to move that country out of the NATO Washington orbit. And I suspect there may be possibly that at work as well. We'd really have to get an idea of the breakdown of share ownership in those major German media outlets. But let me continue with what he says. The unanswered question is, why does German mainstream media serve Washington instead of Germany? Does Washington pay well for its propaganda services? If we now come to recent events in Ferguson, these incidents made us realize that the U.S. police state is not just on the rise, but is already in place. Scenes on TV and internet videos of brutal militarized police equipped for battlefield combat, applying extreme violence to protesters and journalists alike, has raised the question in Europe whether America is a democracy or a police state. And remember, folks, the Germans, having gone through the Nazi period and the Nazi era and the post-war period and all of that, are extraordinarily sensitive to this issue. The continuing American massacre of people in the Middle East, together with Washington's support for Israel's massacre of Palestinians and now the massacre of Russians in eastern and southern Ukraine by the government that Washington installed in Kiev, have changed the image of America from white hat to black hat. America no longer reassures us. America frightens us, unquote. Now, I'm going to pass now to, in this context, to a recent series of remarks that Chancellor Angela Merkel made in an interview on German public television, excuse me. And I want you to listen very, very carefully to this, folks, because I think this is extraordinary. I think these remarks are the beginning indicators. Again, they're slight, but they're the beginning indicators that Germany's just about had enough. But they're going to play this very carefully and very subtly. They're not going to just bolt. They're going to keep walking the fence line, but they are going to keep upping the pressure, gradually upping the pressure. Now listen very carefully. Germany's, and this article is entitled "Merkel, the Ukraine can go to Eurasian Union." Quote, Germany's Angela Merkel has said the Ukraine is free to go to Russia's Eurasian Union amid signs of a new willingness to make peace with Russian leader Vladimir Putin. Speaking to the German public broadcaster ARD on Sunday, the 24th of August, that's just last Sunday, folks, the German chancellor said her visit to Kiev on Saturday was designed to prepare for peace talks between the Ukrainian president Petro Poroshenko and Putin in Minsk on Tuesday, but warned the public not to expect a breakthrough. Now listen carefully. These are direct quotes of Chancellor Merkel. Quote, and if the Ukraine says we are going to the Eurasian Union now, the European Union would never make a big conflict out of it, but would insist on a voluntary decision, unquote, Merkel added. And then continuing, quote, again, Chancellor Merkel, pardon me, I want to find a way, excuse me, I've had a bad sinus, as many others do, which does not damage relations with Russia as well. We want reasonable relations with Russia. We are depending on one another, and there are so many other conflicts in the world where we should work together, so I hope we can make progress. Now, let me go to the very end of this article, because there is a series of 3 concluding paragraphs that attempt to put this into perspective, and listen carefully. Quote, Andrei Ilyarinov, a former aide to Putin who works for the Cato Institute, a think tank in Washington, also wrote on his blog on Sunday that there is a Merkel-Putin deal in the making. He said it includes the Ukraine talks with pro-Russian rebels that would freeze the conflict and give Putin de facto control of the eastern Ukraine, a promise that the Ukraine will never join the EU, and a promise it will never join NATO. Now remember, this is exactly what the Council on Foreign Relations article by Mersheimer advocated that I blogged about last week. So you're seeing a bit of behind the scenes maneuvering and agreement on a consensus, a policy different than that being advocated out of Washington. Merkel, in her ARD interview, added, quote, NATO membership for the Ukraine is not on the agenda, unquote. She added that Poroshenko's participation at a NATO summit in September in Wales is part of a NATO-Ukraine cooperation, quote, but not membership, unquote. So there you have it, folks. I think you're seeing the first signs of a new sort of agreement and diplomatic working relationship between Russia and Germany. And I think in the long term, this is a signal that if Washington does not veer away from the policy it's been embarked upon since the demise of the Soviet Union, since the era of the Clinton administration, with the massive expansion of NATO, that eventually this policy is going to force first Germany and then probably the other major European powers to bolt. That's it for my news and views for this Thursday, August 28th, 2014. I'll see everybody on the flip side, and God bless.